It's a family history and a memoir. Now, I grew up a working class lesbian at a time when those categories had very different meanings. I didn't realise at that time that being a lesbian was even a choice I could make. Of course, we live, at least in this country, in a very different world today. But back then, in the 70s, when I was a teenager, homosexuality had only just been decriminalised, and attitudes haven't really changed since Victorian times. People were still being put in asylums, people were still being given electric shock treatment for being gay. So, in my despair, my confusion, I ended up marrying my boyfriend of the time when I was just 18 years old. It was kind of a desperate bid to prove my heterosexuality to the world and to myself. It wasn't long before I realised I'd made a terrible mistake. I knew I loved women, and I knew I wanted to make women love me, and honestly that's a project I've been working on ever since. But I realised I've got to come out, and coming out, of course, is something that gay people have to do every day of their lives. Every time you fill a form in, every time you meet new people or get a new job, you've got to come out all over again. But this first piece I'm going to read is about my first coming out when I was 21, and I didn't need glasses then either. They do these days. I told my husband that I thought I was gay, but he didn't believe me. Instead, he thought I was unhappy because I hadn't finished my education, and he offered to support me through A-levels. This was generous of him, but his altruism also tied me to him in gratitude. I began studying English, history and sociology at the FE College in the September of 1979. I loved academic study, and at 21 had more of a sense of the value of it than I would have done earlier. Of course, I fancied my English teacher like crazy, and this had a salutary effect on the quality of my essays. In fact, she suggested that I should think about sitting the Oxbridge exam on the strength of a stonking good essay I'd written on Evelyn Waugh's A Handful of Dust. It's amazing how desire can sharpen the wits. But in my despondency surrounding my sexuality, I was still taking too many bathtub blues and abrading my molars whilst cleaning behind the taps with a cotton bud in the middle of the night. During this period, I became friendly with my husband's sister, Jackie, the witch, who had by now left her junkie husband. My husband had a distinct lack of familial affection, and he was particularly suspicious of this outlandish sister. She and I got along like a house on fire. She had all manner of weird and wonderful mates. Unlike her brother, she did believe I was a lesbian and offered to introduce me to a bisexual witch friend of hers and come with me to the Princess Royal, Northampton's only gay pub. I'd been longing to go there, but feared that such an act would prove irrevocable. On a Saturday night, just before Christmas, Jackie took me to visit the bisexual witch. She was a 50-something faded beauty with raven black dyed hair. She gave me tea and invited me into her parlour to read my tarot cards. As she turned each card, she talked about emotional journeys and the difficult process of renewal. At the end, she took my hand in hers and intoned, "My dear, you must find yourself a nice little straight girl and make her gay." Armed with this intelligence, Jackie and I left and went to the Princess Royal. It was small and packed, and after the pub shut, there was a private members club upstairs. Jackie and I got signed in by a pair of elderly gay men, and within the hour, I'd been picked up by a gorgeous young lesbian called Jane. She had blonde hair and smelled heavenly. Jane had the kind of confidence born of being at the centre of a crowd of outsiders. She lived with two bitchy gay men who protected her like vituperative mother hens. She'd had every available lesbian in a 50-mile radius. Jane knew exactly what she wanted, and that was an older straight woman who had been her affair, then rejected her for the security of heterosexuality. In those days, gays used affair as a noun defining the person rather than the activity. There was to me something powerfully exotic about this affectation. I wanted to be an affair. I took Jane back to my marital home and we had sex on the living room floor. She scratched my back to ribbons. The next morning, my husband woke us up. He opened the living room door and then closed it again. Jane gathered up her clothes and fled into the morning. My husband, seething with barely controlled rage and disgust, told me to get out of the house. He was actually vomiting into the kitchen sink as I packed a suitcase and left. I went to my parents for the holidays and I had a date with Jane for New Year's Eve. My spirit soared with a sense of freedom and joy I felt as I hauled my luggage to Mum and Dad's council flat in Jimmy's End. As I passed a pub, Brass in Pocket came blaring out of the door. It went to #1 that week. The date didn't go so well. Jane, it transpired, was far too much in love with the older straight woman and barely spoke to me all evening. She didn't protest when at 2 a.m. I said I'd walk home. That was a bitter cold night, and alone in the dark streets, I foresaw that this queer thing wasn't going to be plain sailing. Leaving my husband also meant I'd have to leave college and get a job. This I did, and by the middle of January I secured a post in the personnel department of the county council. On the strength of the expected salary, I also took a room in a house. It was tiny and bleak, with a single bed and a Formica table, but it was better than staying with my parents. My dad had stopped drinking by this time and was far less confrontational with me, but I needed to be alone to explore my shiny new sexual orientation, and I wasn't yet ready to tell them about it. The job was just another office, but I worked opposite a lovely, ethereal young woman called Wendy. We quickly became allies in the office politics game. We also shared a sense of humour, so we spent much of the day pissing ourselves laughing about the bizarre lives and habits of our colleagues. I was burning an entire box of candles at every end. Being the new lesbian on a very small block meant that I was snapped up by those more seasoned dykes around town. The scene for women in those days revolved around the home of a woman called Pat. She'd been a dolly bird of the 1960s and was still absolutely stunning. Think of the young Joanna Lumley and you'd not be a million miles away. She shared this home with the even more beautiful Helen, who drove an MG sports car and entertained an international string of lovely young women. Pat was the second woman I slept with, and while the encounter was dull, it was illuminating in that we both bore the scarred backs of recent encounters with Jane. There were parties and clubs on 3 or 4 nights a week. Sometimes we piled into Pat's Beetle and went to one-nighters in random small-town locations. And sometimes we went to that famous lesbian cellar, the Gateways in Chelsea. There are some things about being old that are rubbish, but I'm eternally glad that I'm old enough to say I went to the Gates. It was opened in the 60s by a butch dyke called Smithy, and she still presided at the bar, accepting gin from her grateful clientele. This is sheer lesbo memorabilia, but Dusty Springfield used to go to the Gateways. So of course I'm proud to say I went there. As lesbians, we have so little historical connection that you really have to get it where you can. Several mornings each week, I arrived at work straight from the night before with the strains of Echo Beach still ringing in my head. Wendy invariably covered for me. when I couldn't see straight from exhaustion, or I was late. She knew about and totally accepted my lesbianism. She herself was in a strange relationship with a hippie bloke called Jeff, who had a couple of kids by another woman. Wendy seemed to spend a lot of time looking after those kids. She also spent a lot of time with other cool-sounding friends, in particular a couple called Phyllis and Alan Moore, who had a baby. Alan was trying to make it as a comic book writer. This meant they were severely skint, and Wendy tried to help out buying baby clothes and little treats that she couldn't show me in the office. Wendy said we should go out sometime if I ever had a free evening. We arranged to go for a drink, and our office chatter deepened into real friendship. We just never shut up from 7 until they threw us out at midnight. We kissed on the cheek when we said goodbye, and Wendy took my hand and squeezed it tight. It wasn't long before I got chucked out of my horrible little room for having unnatural relationships. The landlady found some semi-naked conquest of mine on the landing, and I got my marching orders the following day. I had to go back to Mum and Dad's for a spell. While I was there, I came down with some bug, probably brought on by too much partying, and was off work for a week. Wendy came to visit me on the Tuesday night. She bought a bag of oranges and the Pretenders' new album. We ate the oranges and played the album in my bedroom. She told me that she'd lost her appetite because she was in love. I had noticed that she'd lost a lot of weight, and I idiotically asked who the lucky guy was. We were sitting on the floor, leaning against my bed. She looked at me long and closed her beautiful eyes. Wordlessly, we kissed, and in our embrace ended on my bed, where we made love silently, with the muffled sound of Minder coming from the telly in the living room. We were head over heels in love. Everything was shining and golden, and the springtime around us just exploded. I started to live at Wendy's flat most of the time. She'd broken up with the hippie, and he'd left, claiming to be happy that she'd found herself. I realised that I needed now to tell my family that I was gay. This was a proper relationship, and it was the first time I'd been in love. I went to see my mum the next Saturday lunchtime. Dad was in the living room watching Grandstand. She visited around me making cheese on toast, and I said, "Mum, I've met someone, and I'm in love." "Oh, that's good," she replied. "What's his name?" "Her name's Wendy, Mum. I'm a lesbian." She laid the cheese on the bread thoughtfully and said, "Where, Deb? The things you do."